Thank you for joining our webinar. From Caliber Leadership Systems, this is the first in a series of webinars on dysfunctional leadership styles. Our topic today is how to survive working with a narcissistic leader. Over our 25 plus years of working closely with executive teams and individual leaders on behavioral change, leadership, and organizational development, combined with our research on personality style, neuroscience, and the emotional drivers of behavior, we have come to identify 4 distinct dysfunctional leadership styles. Each has its own challenges as well as its own path towards development. Each represents a different negative impact on the organizations in which they lead, impacts that can often lead to dysfunction within the organization, or even just a failure to achieve the potential of the organization. We chose to start with the narcissistic leader as their impact is felt strongly by those who work with them. This webinar is part 2 on the narcissistic leader. The first identifies the 6 signs that you are in fact working with a narcissistic leader. This webinar that you're watching today gives you 4 key ways to survive working for or with a narcissistic leader. And finally, part 3 tackles how to actually change their behavior as it is possible. It is our hope when you have completed our 3 webinars on narcissistic leaders that you will be able to identify them by their behavior and impact, know how to deal with them personally to minimize their impact on you, and understand what it takes to actually change their behavior. They bring great strengths to our organizations, so shifting them out of their dysfunctional behavioral pattern is key to getting the most from these leaders. There is a lot of confusion about the differences between people who are narcissistic versus those who have a narcissistic personality disorder. The narcissistic leader is not mentally ill, does not have a personality disorder, and is most interested in gaining power, money, and prestige. They may act the same and seem indistinguishable to those with a personality disorder for most people. However, their self-esteem is not as fragile, and they are able to develop new behaviors. They seem the same because they use the same dysfunctional behaviors to achieve their agenda. In part 1, we detail the characteristics of the narcissistic leader. So, for the purposes of this webinar, just to recap quickly, again, focused on gaining money, power, and prestige. They're very shrewd in dealing with each other's and incredibly competitive. They have strong belief in themselves and thoughts in terms of grandiosity, in terms of their own self-importance and their own ability to do things. They absolutely lack empathy and the ability to put themselves in other people's shoes, preoccupied with envy and how they compete or stand relative to others. But last but not least, and most importantly, they are able to develop new behaviors. So how do you survive working for a narcissistic leader? Well, first and foremost, we must protect their image at all times. It's very important to remember that you never confront a narcissistic leader because we want to give them feedback in a way that doesn't make them look bad. We want to avoid situations that may shame them because when we do that, we find that they have to retaliate in order to restore their image. I was working with a client recently and I was providing some feedback that I'd received from employees about working with this particular leader. And we'd started off the whole conversation and he was very open and he was giving me the impression that he really wanted the feedback and was very excited to have me there and to be hearing about it. But the second I started to put things on the table whereby it perhaps wasn't shining the best light on him, he immediately shifted his position, even at the table, to being more aggressive, leaning forward, pointing his finger at me, telling me that I was making things up, that I had no idea what I was talking about, and really going on the attack. And you can see how in that particular situation, even though it was just myself, him, and one other individual in the room, he really felt the need to retaliate against me in order to restore that image. And I could feel myself shifting back initially, a little bit out of surprise, because I hadn't had a lot of experience working with this individual. So I had to shift back into it, really being empathetic, and respectful, mindful of his sensitivity to shame and humiliation, because it wasn't going to serve us. And so I said, well, let's not get into debating it. Let me go put more detail to it. So you can read some of the comments verbatim. We can really get a sense of what people have said. Of course, in the back of my mind, I had a better sense of what it was that employees were talking about when they told me about some of the reactions that they experienced. So we really want to look interested in what it is they're talking about when they're talking to us, buttering them up. And I know some of you may be reacting to that thought, but really giving an occasional compliment, asking a question that shows that you're looking for their advice or guidance on something, sharing an interesting tidbit with them, or thanking them for some positive contribution. Whatever it is that we're working to do in order to survive working with this particular leadership style, we do have to be conscious of protecting their image at all times. Now, that doesn't mean we want you lying about a compliment or putting down our own skills in the conversation. Really, it's just allowing the opportunity to be there where the focus is on him or her for a few minutes, and not getting defensive because their comments really aren't about you. So really, it's looking at their insecurities and their lack of effective social skills, and how do you help to support and protect their image at all times. Tip number 2 is knowing yourself. Really, in this tip, this is about looking within and saying, what are your hot buttons and some of your own problematic responses? What is your worth independent of his or her evaluation of you? So the narcissistic leader will make everything about them. And so we want to make sure that in order to survive working with this particular dysfunctional leadership style, that we're not putting them ahead of our own goals, objectives, and ambitions. And that just because they devalue you, it doesn't mean you have to go out of your way to prove yourself. So one of the things that I've often found, because I obviously work with a lot of these leaders over the course of my career, and I can always tell when there's one in the room because I'm a little bit edgier and I'm waiting for something to come at me. And I remember very distinctly one of the individuals in a group that I worked with off and on for many, many years, his way of coming at this, again, he was the narcissistic leadership style, was he'd always make comments about my markers and my flip charts. And of course, to facilitate discussion and strategy and problem solving within leadership teams, I need to be marking down our conversations. But I could feel that, need to be defensive and that need to react relative to it. And so it was my own awareness of what was my hot button there and what it was that he was doing and how I was reacting, so I could actually be prepared for it, but also be prepared to engage in it in a different way as opposed to reacting it, right? So not trying to feel like I have to justify myself, but really being able to hold my value so I wasn't getting triggered by the kinds of things that this particular individual would say to me. So tip number 3, and again, this kind of ties into tip number 2, but we can't take their behavior personally. It really is not about you. So having self-control, having patience, really believing in and understanding the limitations of the narcissistic leader. One of the mistakes people make is thinking they should be something different. And so when we're working with these individuals is shifting from that place of, wanting to do what we feel is right in reaction to them, as opposed to choosing to do what is really right for the situation, for the business, for ourselves. So when we react to the narcissistic leader because they are devaluing us, it actually only makes us look bad because it's an emotional response. I remember one of my clients relaying a story to me about how she was sitting with her boss, who's a narcissistic leader, and this woman's the head of human resources in an organization with many, many years of experience behind her. he was proceeding to tell her how an HR function should be run and all in the ways in which that he knew better than she did how she should be running her function. And so she found herself getting upset by it and reacting to it and challenging him and questioning it and really getting emotional in her response to it because she was feeling devalued as a result of the conversation. So really it's important to understand that the way they make you feel doesn't actually define you. It really is about them, and so you have to stay objective. In her case, you can see that her unraveling in that meeting actually worked against her because now he had in his mind evidence to be more dismissive of her and to believe that she wasn't actually capable of performing at the level. But really it was simply her, in part, her shock and her not really understanding where it was that this person was coming to at the time. Of course, she's now since learned to deal with that. So it really, we have to not get into that wanting to explain, defend, or fight with them. We want to have to resist the urge to put them down or to challenge them back, because it really is human nature to put down those who act superior without deserving it. And this isn't a democracy here. So you have to keep that in mind when you're working with a narcissistic leader, that even though we don't like those who put themselves above everyone else or devalue us in order to make themselves feel better, we still have to resist the urge. Otherwise, the narcissistic leader will come back to bite us. So we're not trying to withhold our empathy or our respect. We don't want to punish them. We want to really understand them, and we want to be able to stay objective so we're not personalizing their behavior. That allows us to remain in the relationship, allow us to be effective, and it will ultimately save us time and keep us from getting hammered by the narcissistic leader. So tip number 4 is setting boundaries. And while it might not seem fair that you have to manage up in this fashion, remember that you are capable of many, many things that the narcissistic leader is not. The narcissistic leader is disconnected from empathy, sharing, collaborating, considering others. So it is very important to have our boundaries and to work to manage up and to influence the narcissistic leader. And when we talk about setting boundaries, it really is about what are going to be the terms of our interactions and how are we going to do it without confrontation. Okay? So while narcissistic leaders don't always engender compassion in others, they are equally entitled to be understood and helped. And so challenging some of our own assumptions and shoulds about their behavior, they should do this or they should do that or they shouldn't do this, it really allows you to really get in there and help and direct them, which is part of your role is managing up and influencing. So reinforcing positive behavior, avoiding criticism, agreeing with the acceptable parts of their statements and adding things like, I wonder if, or how about, or this could be a benefit to you. Discourage negative behaviors, so any sort of belittling or dominance that you may see from them. And we use what we talk about as non-confrontational limit setting. One of the things that I will often do is when I'm in an engagement with this and I find that they're shifting, is that I may actually get up and walk over to a whiteboard or a flip chart. I might go, take that moment to go get myself some water. I might just sort of shift the discussion around. Sometimes I'll even put my hands up and in sort of a sign of surrender and say, can we look at this in a different way? And so again, it's like using those boundaries so that we can keep guiding the conversation on. But again, it goes back to that self-awareness is if I understand and I'm prepared for that discussion, I'm focused on influencing up and I'm actually working to contain their behavior, I can actually get the individual to where it is that we want to go. And never ever feel like you have to listen too long. Narcissistics are very eager for your attention, and that's important to understand, and they won't let go of it. So practice setting limits on your conversations by having another activity you need to do, by setting some time limits, listen attentively for a few minutes, let them know you have to go, move on to your next activity. I know one of my clients uses the technique of standing up. If the individuals, if they're in a meeting and they're coming to the end of it, they're still talking, she stands up because again, it demonstrates that we're coming to an end. And so it's a polite way of doing it, but it allows her to hold the boundary of time relative to it. And again, if you know that you are working with that particular style, like one of the things that I'll often do is, even though I may book the meeting for an hour, I will in my own calendar set it for longer. So that allows it to give them the time to get off what they need to get off, for us to work things through without them feeling rushed or cut off. And so I'm not stressed because I haven't backed myself up into that corner. So I am setting boundaries and I'm setting the terms of the interactions, but I may or may not be explicit about that. So just to wrap up, a couple of things to remember. Most importantly, that we need to accept their limitations, because that really goes a long way to managing their behavior and managing our own capacity to hold our confidence and to really survive our experiences of working for them. Don't think that they should be different than they are, and don't try to fix them, particularly when you're not in a position of influence or authority rather, over them. In part 3 of this webinar series, we do talk about strategies for development, but really, if you're working for them or with them and you don't have that direct authority, or it's not your role to coach them or to develop them, then really we have to come to that place of acceptance, okay? I remember one of my clients who was a very, very high potential, high performing individual did not like the way the CEO was handling something, and the CEO was definitely a narcissistic leader. And so he moved in to try to set them straight. And it really was, it's not the path to walk on, because what that narcissistic leader then did to that individual, who was in his mind working in the best interests of the organization and of his particular area of the business, the narcissistic leader that he reported to basically set out to destroy him, to destroy his reputation and his career as a result of it. And so really you do have to take a step back and decide what is in your best interest as well. We want to make sure that we are not allowing them to self-destruct or to lead the company for disaster. I have one of my clients where they hired in a new COO who has this leadership style, this dysfunctional leadership style. In the course of 6 months, he has managed to alienate the entire executive team that has been in place for years, running a very, very successful company. He's lost, I think it's now 75% of his executive team, very talented people. And again, I could understand that in an environment where the organization had not been performing or functioning, but that had not been the case here. And so we've watched this organization go from being one with very high levels of engagement, very high success rate from a financial perspective, from an industry benchmarking perspective, to having been slowed down to pretty much no growth. Their financial results have dropped. Their levels of engagement are down in the tank, and also the level of turnover, which before they'd had none. They have massive levels of turnover now at all levels of the organization. So this is where they can actually get in there and lead the company to disaster, because they are not seeing what else is going on, and they don't have compassion and empathy. In their minds, they're right, and they're working from that place of I'm right and I know what's best in this particular situation. And again, finally, approaching their behavior objectively and consistently. It is very difficult to get near to them, and they must recognize that they can benefit from help before they'll actually go towards that. And so for employees, really for us, it's about learning how to work around them and to be able to hold our confidence and our sense of ourselves while we are working with these individuals. So to learn more about narcissistic leaders, I encourage you to check out a couple of our other webinars, the 6 signs of identifying whether or not you are actually, in fact, working for a narcissistic leader, and changing the behavior, how to actually coach the narcissistic leader. And also our other webinars on the other 3 dysfunctional leadership styles series. We work with individuals and organizations globally to drive behavioral change and maximize organizational performance. We look forward to the opportunity to potentially work with you or your organization. And for more information, ensure you don't miss out on any of our webinars or our other tools and techniques for working with dysfunctional behavioral patterns in your organization, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Thanks for your interest.